My name is Nazar and I am 26 years old. On the 24th of December 2023, I walked into the vestibule of the Church of the Nativity in Dearborn, Michigan, with 15 pounds of C4 explosive strapped to my chest. I didn't go there to pray. I went there to send 300 traitors to their graves. I reached for the detonator, my heart pounding with hate, but I never got to press the button. 3 bullets from a security guard tore through my chest. I died on that carpet, drowning in my own blood. But the man who met me in the afterlife wasn't who I expected. It was the very one I had come to erase. And everything I believed shattered in an instant. Before I tell you what I saw on the other side of that explosion, I want to welcome you. Whether you are listening from the Middle East, Europe, or right here in the US, tell me in the comments where you are joining us from. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share these powerful testimonies of light overcoming darkness with the world. I grew up in the United States living a double life. To the outside world, I was a quiet engineering student with wire-rimmed glasses that constantly fogged up in the Michigan winter and a scruffy, unkempt beard. But inside, I was burning with a different kind of fire. I had spent years in the dark corners of the internet, consuming radical ideologies that convinced me the Arab Christians living in our community were not just neighbors, they were cultural traitors, betrayers of our heritage who had sold their souls to a Western God. I felt genuine disgust when I drove past their churches. The idea that God could have a son, that he would lower himself to be born in a manger, seemed like the ultimate blasphemy to me. I was completely certain that purging them was my divine duty. I had prepared for months, isolating myself, cutting off my family, and suppressing the memories of my grandmother, Sidi Noor, who had tried to teach me otherwise. I believed I was walking the path of righteousness straight toward paradise. I was so incredibly wrong, so terribly, devastatingly wrong about everything. I thought I knew exactly what would happen the moment my heart stopped. I expected honor. I expected paradise. But you will never believe the terrifying sound that actually greeted me in the darkness. A sound that unlocked a memory I had spent 10 years trying to forget. Living in Dearborn, Michigan, the heart of the Arab community in America, I was surrounded by the sights and sounds of my heritage, yet I felt completely and utterly alone. While my peers were obsessed with buying new cars or arguing about college football, I was sinking into a digital abyss that consumed every waking hour. My nights were not spent studying for my engineering degree but in encrypted chat rooms, listening to faceless voices from across the ocean that whispered sweet, addictive poison into my ears. They told me that the West was not my home, it was a battlefield. And I was a soldier who had yet to pick up his weapon. My anger, however, wasn't primarily directed at the average American I saw in the grocery store. It was reserved specifically for those I considered the munafiqun, the hypocrites, the Arab Christians. To me, they were the ultimate offense. They looked like us, they spoke the language of the Quran with the same accent as my father, yet they bowed their knees to a Roman cross. They lived among us, eating the same food and wearing the same faces, yet they had sold their spiritual birthright to the West. I viewed them not as neighbors, but as a cancer that needed to be violently cut out to purify the body of our community. Every time I drove past the Church of the Nativity and saw the Arabic script on their sign, I felt a physical wave of nausea. They were cultural traitors, and I became convinced that God was waiting for me to act. My engineering background became the tool of my fanaticism. I didn't need to smuggle a weapon, I knew exactly how to build one. For weeks, my small, sparse apartment smelled of solder, acetone, and hatred. I constructed the vest with the same meticulous, obsessiveness care I applied to my final exams. It wasn't a rushed, sloppy job. It was a masterpiece of destruction, wired to a simple push-button trigger I could conceal in my palm, powered by a battery pack I had salvaged and modified. The morning of December 24th broke with a steel gray sky hanging low over Detroit. I remember standing in my bathroom, shaving the edges of my beard, staring into the mirror at my own dark, hollow eyes. There was no shaking, no hesitation, and no doubt. Just a terrifying glacial calm that settled over my bones. I felt like a surgeon scrubbing in for a necessary operation. I put on a thick plaid button-down, and then I strapped the vest tight against my torso. It felt heavy, a burden of death that I welcomed like an old friend. Then came the oversized winter coat to hide my secret. I looked normal. Just another student braving the Michigan cold. I had planned every second of that night. But there was one variable I hadn't calculated, a variable buried in my own bloodline that was about to scream from the grave. Before the hate turned my heart into stone, there was only the smell of warm cardamom and the soft, trembling hands of Sidi Noor. My grandmother was a tiny woman, weathered by years of hardship in the Levant before she came to America, but her eyes held a light that I never saw in my father or uncles. When I was a boy, before the internet poisoned my mind, I would sit on the floor by her feet while she peeled oranges. It was in those quiet, stolen moments that she would hum melodies that were different from the chants I heard at the mosque. They were forbidden songs, though I didn't know it then. She would stroke my hair and sing in a voice that cracked with age but overflowed with a strange, heavy peace. Lail Sakin, she would whisper, the Arabic words for silent night, drifting through the room like smoke. She never told me it was a hymn about the birth of the Messiah. She simply told me it was a song about a peace the world could not give and could not take away. I loved those songs. I loved the way the tension in the house seemed to evaporate when she sang them. I didn't understand then that she was praying over me, pleading with a God my father said had no son, asking him to guard my soul against the darkness that was waiting to devour it. But as I grew older and the radical ideology began to take root in my teenage mind, Sidi Noor transformed in my eyes. She was no longer my refuge, she became the enemy within. I remember the day I found her Arabic Bible hidden beneath her mattress. It was worn, the pages soft as cloth from decades of turning. My hands shook, not with fear but with a righteous, blinding rage. To me it wasn't a holy book, it was evidence of betrayal. It was the manifesto of the infidels I was learning to hate. I confronted her in the kitchen, shouting words that now haunt my nightmares. I called her a mushrik, an idolater. I told her that her prayers were filth. She didn't scream back. She didn't argue or try to defend her theology. She just looked at me with those ancient, tear-filled eyes, a look of devastating pity that enraged me even more. I took that book, the source of her secret comfort, and I marched to the backyard. I doused it in lighter fluid and watched the pages curl and blacken in the flames, feeling a triumphant sense of purging. I thought I had killed her memory when I burned her Bible. I didn't know that memory was simply waiting for the moment I would take my last breath. The drive to the Church of the Nativity was a blur of red taillights and swirling white flakes. A heavy blizzard had descended on Dearborn, coating the streets in a thick, gray slush that hissed beneath my tires. The heater in my old sedan was blasting, but I couldn't feel the warmth. The only heat I registered was the battery pack taped to my abdomen, a steady, burning reminder of the destruction I carried. The city was quiet, emptied by the holiday, but as I turned the corner onto the avenue where the church stood, the darkness was pushed back by a flood of golden light. I parked across the street, killing the engine but leaving the lights off. I sat there in the silence, watching them. They were arriving in droves. Families bundled in expensive coats, shaking snow from their umbrellas, their breath misting in the freezing air. They looked so happy, so maddeningly peaceful. I watched a group of young men, probably the same age as me, laughing as they held the door open for an elderly woman. They spoke Arabic, their greetings drifting faintly across the road, but they were entering a building topped with a cross. To me, this was the ultimate mockery. They were using the language of the prophet to worship a man. My mind began to recite the justifications I had memorized, the manifesto of hate that had become my scripture. This is not murder, the voice in my head insisted. This is surgery. You are removing a tumor from the heart of the community. I told myself that their smiles were insults to God. I told myself that their celebration was an act of war against the truth. I dehumanized them until they were no longer flesh and blood, but symbols of the corruption I had been ordained to cleanse. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, breathing slowly to steady the adrenaline that was beginning to spike in my blood. Then I saw them. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, knelt down on the snowy sidewalk to adjust the pink wool scarf around his small daughter's neck. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She looked up at him with total trust, her small hand resting on his shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the image of Sidi Noor flashed in my mind, her adjusting my collar before school, but I crushed the memory instantly. I watched a father fix his little girl's scarf, and I told myself it was necessary collateral. But as I stepped out of the car, a strange sensation hit my chest. Not the bomb, but a warning I chose to ignore. The heavy oak doors of the Church of the Nativity were deceptively easy to open. I stepped from the biting, silent chill of the Michigan winter into a wall of sensory overload. The air inside was thick, suffocatingly warm, and heavy with the scent of burning frankincense, a smell that instantly triggered a deep, primal memory of City Noor's funeral. The sound was deafening. A choir of 100 voices was chanting in Arabic, their harmonies rising to the vaulted ceiling, vibrating through the floorboards and into the soles of my boots. Glory al Rab, they sang. Glory to the Lord. To me it sounded like the war cry of the enemy. I kept my head down, pushing my wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of my nose as they instantly fogged in the humidity. My winter coat was bulky, an oversized parka that looked natural outside in the blizzard but was conspicuously large in the crowded, heated vestibule. I had practiced walking naturally with the extra 15 pounds of C4 taped to my chest, but in the moment of truth the weight felt crushing. I felt like I was walking underwater. Sweat began to bead on my forehead, stinging my eyes, betraying the icy calm I had felt in the car. I tried to blend into the stream of latecomers, but I made a fatal mistake. I looked up. Standing near the inner sanctuary doors was the head of security. I learned later his name was Elias. He was a mountain of a man, a former Marine with eyes that didn't just look at people, they dismantled them. He wasn't singing. He was scanning. And as I stepped further onto the plush red carpet, his gaze locked onto me with the precision of a laser sight. He saw the sweat. He saw the unnatural bulk of the coat around my midsection. He saw the terror I was desperately trying to mask as piety. The air between us seemed to crackle with sudden, violent understanding. He didn't ask for a ticket. He didn't wish me a Merry Christmas. He stepped forward, his body angling to shield the crowd behind him, his right hand sweeping back the lapel of his suit jacket. The guard looked at me and I saw his hand move to his holster. My time was up. Listen to me, life ends in a microsecond. If you are sitting there watching this without subscribing, thinking you have all the time in the world to get right with God or support this channel, you are lying to yourself. Don't be like me. Don't wait until the gun is pointed at you. Subscribe now. Do it before the screen goes black. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced my chest. I knew I couldn't make it to the center of the sanctuary. I had to end it here. I jammed my hand into my pocket, my fingers scrambling for the plastic switch. He drew his weapon. I reached for the trigger. But what happened in that split second wasn't just physics, it was divine intervention that should have killed me, yet somehow didn't. Chapter 5. 3 bullets in the floor. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a physical blow that shattered the world into jagged fragments. I never heard the gunshots. I only felt them. It was as if an invisible sledgehammer had swung out of the incense-filled air and struck me directly in the center of my chest. 1, 2, 3. The force was absolute, lifting me off my feet and throwing me backward with violent disdain. My thumb was millimeters from the button. I had sent the command from my brain to my hand, press it, kill them, finish it, but the signal never arrived. The shock to my system was total. My arm went numb, dead weight swinging uselessly at my side as the detonator clattered onto the tile, sliding away from my reach like a taunt. I hit the ground hard, the back of my head cracking against the floor, and for a second the world went white. Then came the noise. The choir stopped instantly. The majestic chanting was replaced by a collective gasp that seemed to suck all the air out of the vestibule, followed immediately by screams. Terrified, piercing screams in Arabic and English. I saw legs running, shoes scrambling for traction, the blur of coats and dresses. I tried to lift my head, tried to crawl toward the device, but my body had resigned. I was paralyzed, pinned to the ornate red carpet by an agony that radiated from my sternum like molten lead. I looked down. The plaid shirt I had carefully ironed that morning was gone, replaced by a ruin of shredded fabric and gore. A dark, warm tide was rising rapidly around me, soaking into the wool of my coat, spreading across the carpet in an expanding halo. I was drowning on dry land. The metallic taste of copper filled my mouth, choking me. Struggling for breath, I tilted my head back, my glasses askew and cracked. My vision began to tunnel, the edges turning gray and fuzzy. Directly above me, painted onto the high vaulted ceiling of the vestibule, was a fresco. It depicted a host of angels blowing trumpets, their faces serene, their eyes looking down with what felt like infinite judgment. I stared at them and they stared back, unmoving, unblinking. I had come to send these people to hell, but now I was the only one dying. The irony was a bitter pill that stuck in my throat along with the blood. The screaming began to sound distant, like it was coming from underwater. The face of the security guard, Elias, loomed over me, his weapon still trained on my chest, shouting commands I couldn't understand. But his voice was fading. The heat of the vestibule turned to ice. My heart gave one last frantic kick against my ribs and then surrendered. As the lights of the church faded, I waited for the angels of death to congratulate me. Instead, the floor opened up and I fell into a silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing my bones. I didn't land. I simply ceased to exist in any place that had coordinates or dimensions. The sensation of falling stopped, replaced by a suspension in a vacuum so complete that even the concept of direction became meaningless. I tried to open my eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were open or closed. There was only blackness, not the blackness of a room with the lights off, but a living, breathing obsidian weight that pressed against my very soul. It was a darkness that wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of life. I waited. My mind, stripped of its physical brain but still frantically active, began to scream for what I had been promised. Where is it? I demanded in the silence. Where are the rivers of milk and honey? Where are the green gardens? Where are the 72 companions? I had fulfilled the covenant. I had sacrificed my life to purge the infidels. I was a martyr. I was supposed to be welcomed as a prince of the faith. But there was no scent of musk, no greeting of salam, no warmth of divine approval. There was only the cold. A biting, absolute cold that felt like being buried naked in a glacier of isolation. Slowly, the terrifying truth began to seep into my consciousness. I had been lied to. The manifesto, the chat rooms, the angry sermons, they had promised me a kingdom for my hatred, but hatred had only purchased me a grave in the void. I was completely, utterly alone with the person I had become, and I realized with dawning horror that I was my own tormentor. The silence was so profound it amplified my own internal panic until it felt like a siren screaming in my mind. Then the sound changed. At first, I thought it was a hallucination, a final firing of my dying neurons. It started as a low hum, a vibration that rippled through the suffocating darkness. It wasn't the roar of hellfire, nor was it the thundering voice of judgment I had feared. It was a melody. Soft, fragile, and impossibly tender. It drifted toward me from an infinite distance, growing steadily clearer. Lail Sakin Lail Makadas, Silent Night, Holy Night. The words were Arabic, but the tune was the very anthem of the traitors I had tried to kill. It washed over me, and for the first time in the void, the cold receded just an inch. I tried to cover my ears to block out the infidel song, but I had no hands. I was forced to listen. The voice wasn't a choir of angels. It was trembling, aged, and steeped in a lifetime of sorrow and love. The darkness was absolute, but the voice was familiar. It wasn't an angel. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years, singing a song that would tear my soul apart. The melody of Sidi Noor's song didn't just hang in the air. It began to weave itself into a fabric of light. At first, it was a pinprick, a single star in a universe of ink, but then it exploded outward with the force of a supernova. The suffocating darkness didn't just fade, it was violently expelled, chased away by a radiance so pure and intense that it felt like it was scorching the sin right out of my consciousness. The cold that had frozen my spirit instantly evaporated, replaced by a heat that was simultaneously terrifying and comforting, like standing too close to a roaring hearth in the dead of winter. I tried to look away, but the magnetism of the light was irresistible. As my spiritual vision adjusted, the brilliance coalesced into a form. A man stepped out of the glory, walking toward me across the nothingness. He was not the pale, soft-featured figure I had seen in the art of the West, the image I had mocked as weak and foreign. No, the man standing before me was undeniably of my blood. He had skin the color of the desert sands, a beard like the men of my tribe, and features that were carved from the ancient lineage of the Middle East. He looked like a king, regal and terrifying, yet he wore no crown of gold. I trembled, shrinking back, waiting for him to draw a sword. But he carried no weapon. His power didn't come from what he held, it came from who he was. His eyes locked onto mine and I gasped. They were eyes of fire, burning with a holiness that exposed every secret thought I had ever hidden. But within that fire was an ocean of infinite, crushing sadness. It was the look of a father watching his son run into a burning building. He didn't look at me with hate. He looked at me with a heartbreak so profound it felt heavier than the condemnation I deserved. He stopped just a few feet from me. The silence returned, but this time it was pregnant with awe. Then he spoke. His voice sounded like the rushing of many waters, yet it was intimate, whispering directly into the core of my being. He spoke in perfect, classical Arabic, the language of my prayers, the language I had used to curse him. "Nizar?" he said, and my name sounded like a song in his mouth. "Why do you persecute me?" The question struck me harder than the bullets had. I stammered in my mind, confused. "I didn't persecute you," I wanted to scream. "I was fighting the West. I was fighting the traitors." But as I looked into his face, the lie crumbled. I realized with sickening clarity that every insult I had hurled at the Christians, every drop of hatred I had nurtured, had been a stone thrown directly at this man. I tried to argue. I tried to recite my theology. But then he showed me something, a vision of the very people I had tried to kill, and what I saw broke me into a million pieces. With a gentle sweep of his hand, the space around us rippled like a pond disturbed by a stone, and the void was replaced by a living window into the very sanctuary I had entered moments before. But I was no longer seeing it through the foggy lenses of my wire-rimmed glasses or the red haze of my murderous rage. I was seeing it through his eyes. I saw the congregation, the men, the women, the children, standing amidst the chaos of the shooting, but time seemed to have paused or shifted. They were not screaming, they were singing. The same melody that had pulled me from the brink of the abyss filled the scene. Lail Sakin, Lail Makadas. They were singing praises to God in the tongue of my ancestors. I saw their hearts, not as physical organs but as vessels of blinding light. I had called them traitors, but as I looked at their spirits, I saw a purity and a devotion that shamed my ritualistic piety. They were not worshipping a Western idol, they were pouring out love to the Creator of the universe. Then my breath hitched in my throat. Standing among them, glowing with a radiance that outshone the church chandeliers, was Sidi Noor. She was no longer bent by age or frailty. She stood tall, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of the little girl with the pink scarf, the child I had been willing to turn into collateral damage. My grandmother looked up, her eyes meeting mine across the barrier of life and death, and she smiled. It was the smile of triumph, not over me but for me. She was singing to the Prince of Peace, joined by the very people I had hated, united in a bond of love that no explosive could ever sever. "I am not the God of confusion, Nizar," Jesus whispered, his voice vibrating in my chest. "I am the God of love. And love does not kill, it gives life." Behind him, a rugged wooden cross appeared. It wasn't a piece of jewelry or a decoration. It was a rugged instrument of torture, stained with blood, yet pulsing with power. I watched in horror as the black, tar-like substance of my hatred, the intent of the bomb, the years of bitterness, the desire to murder, began to flow out of me. It didn't vanish into the air, it flew toward the cross. The wood absorbed it all. The violence I intended for the church was swallowed up by his sacrifice. I realized then that he had taken the explosion meant for them into his own heart 2,000 years ago. He stepped closer, his face filling my vision. "I took your violence so you could have my peace," he said. "But the door must be opened from the inside." He offered me a choice. I could die in my hate and stay in the darkness, or I could accept the blood he shed for me. I made my choice, and then I felt a jolt of electricity that I thought was the fires of hell. The fire I felt wasn't the heat of hell, it was the defibrillator of God's grace restarting a heart that had no right to beat. I gasped back into the world of the living, waking up in the ICU of a Detroit hospital, my chest bound in heavy gauze and my wrists handcuffed to the metal rails of the bed. The room was filled with the beep of monitors and the hushed, confused whispers of surgeons. They were staring at my x-rays like they were looking at a ghost. "It's medically impossible," one of them said, shaking his head. 3 shots at point-blank range. Every major artery was missed by millimeters. They called it a fluke. I called it a second chance. When the federal agents arrived, they expected a stone-faced soldier of the jihad, a man who would spit at them and recite slogans of war. Instead, they found a broken man who couldn't stop weeping. I gave them everything. I confessed to the plot, the bomb, the network, and the hatred. I didn't try to plea bargain. I didn't try to hide. I accepted the earthly consequences of my actions because I had already received a heavenly pardon I didn't deserve. A week later, a visitor was cleared to see me. It was Father Abraham, the pastor of the Church of the Nativity, the shepherd of the flock I had tried to slaughter. When he walked into my hospital room, I turned my face to the wall, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. I expected him to curse me. I expected him to tell me I was a monster. Instead, I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Nizar," he said softly, "we are not angry. We are just glad you finally came home." He told me that the church had held a prayer vigil for my soul while I was in surgery. The love of Jesus, which I had mocked for years, was the only thing standing between me and the darkness. Exactly 1 year later, I stood in that same church. I wasn't wearing a suicide vest. I was wearing a white robe. The sanctuary was packed, not with victims but with witnesses. The security guard, Elias, stood in the front row wiping his eyes. As I stepped into the warm water of the baptismal pool, the choir began to sing. It was the melody that had saved me in the void. Lail Sakin. Silent Night. As the pastor lowered me into the water, I buried the man of hate forever. I rose from the water gasping, tears streaming down my face, surrounded by the family I had tried to kill, singing the song of Sidi Noor. I was finally truly alive. I was a murderer in my heart, and yet he saved me. I risked everything to find the truth. Now look at you. You have heard this entire testimony. If you leave this video without subscribing, without commenting, "I believe," then you are walking away from the same open door that saved me. Don't let your heart be hard. Subscribe. Join us. Or will you wait until it's too late to realize what you've rejected?